and also then starting to plan around family routes, starting to make modifications for UK nationals leaving, and also starting work on could we activate our AUK2 system, which is the online application system that's used, for example, by EEA nationals for Ukrainians.
Can I just stop you there? So a decision was made to not look at a wider refugee policy. You decided at that stage you were going to use an existing immigration or migration route. Why was that?
Well, let me perhaps look at why not a potential resettlement route, partly inspired by our experience with Afghanistan, where we'd removed a very large number of people, the biggest evacuation since Dunkirk within a couple of weeks. But then people hadn't had homes, hadn't had places. We've struggled to get offers from communities. We looked at, for example, whilst great work done in other resettlement schemes, such as community sponsorship and the Syrian scheme, those were circumstances where the numbers were, for example, 20,000 over a number of years. Well, that wasn't going to be suitable. And we compared that to, for example, the Hong Kong BNO route, which we created, where 100,000 people have applied and tens of thousands have arrived in the UK in the last year, which was perhaps closer to the type of numbers we would expect. And in terms of looking at, no one knew exactly the level of attack Vladimir Putin would launch against Ukraine. That was still a debate at the time. But that's why we'd look at something that could be expanded rapidly, that wasn't reliant on, for example, identifying via NGOs, people to be resettled, which is how our usual resettlement routes. So, as I say, very much inspired by the BNO route and that type of approach, which has seen tens of thousands arrive within a year of its launch.
That was a specific route for people to come from Hong Kong. You've just using a more general migration control mechanism to control the flow from Ukraine, aren't you?
Well, ultimately, that route isn't capped. This one isn't capped. We looked at how we could both do basic security checks, how we could ensure our country is protected, how certain safeguarding issues are delivered. Certainly there are strong issues with children being brought out of particular areas, potentially with adults who might be a relative but they've rarely met or even may never met at all. And we believe this was an appropriate way of providing the capacity and capability quite quickly, with events then moving on and, of course, adapting, following on. So that's where our inspiration is that within numbers we're going to need to be within the tens of thousands, not within the low thousands of resettlements, for example, from working with NGOs and going through a nomination process, which clearly would take too long.
So just so I'm clear, you're saying it was about controlling numbers then?
No, it's about controlling flow. As I just touched on, our resettlement schemes have traditionally been of far lower numbers than the numbers that we've welcomed. We've welcomed tens of thousands via the BNO route quickly and within 1 year. That far exceeds any other resettlement scheme we've offered in recent times.
I think the problem that we've come across with the scheme you're operating, and Enver Solomon from the Refugee Council said this to us last week, that the government wasn't adopting a refugees first approach, but a paperwork over people approach. And I just wondered what your response to that is.
Well, first I'll bring perhaps Lord Harrington in a moment, but at first I'd note that compared to some of our key allies, Canada, the United States haven't opened their routes yet. We have got our route open, and again our motivations were based very much on one, balancing security of our country, safeguarding interests of others, but having a system that could stand up quickly to welcome tens of thousands, not the low thousands, which we'd expect to have happened if we went through our traditional refugee resettlement paths. Right,
but of course this has been fraught with difficulty, and welcoming tens of thousands isn't where we're at, is it? I think, is it 4,600, the latest figures that have...
5,500.
5,500, so still relatively low.
With 1,000 outstanding applications.
And how many applications have been made in total?
We have 20,000 have been submitted, many of those in the last few. Some of those are people who will now certainly want to go into the permission to travel scheme, but say 5,500 have been issued, and I'm not just talking away that they're now issued.
So 5,500 have been issued and 20,000 have applied?
So far, yes.
So far. Okay, I just want to ask you, before I come to Diane Abbott, just a couple of other issues that were raised in the evidence last week. So the first one was about the Refugee Council's view, and the lawyers that we met with last week, about the requirement for a visa and the problems, the bureaucracy the need for people to travel large distances to get to a visa application centre, the queues at the centres. What was put to us was that the biometric checks and the checks in terms of security could all be done either at the port before someone left France or Belgium, wherever they were travelling from, or when they arrive in the United Kingdom. We do that with many other countries that don't require a visa to travel. For instance, Mexico. You can come from Mexico and all these checks are done at the border. So why can that not happen